think about anything.
Hey, Bill.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It is a beautiful day outside.
Oh my.
We are inside and we are working on S-127. It is Wednesday, May 7th. And it looks like a very long stack of witnesses, but I just want to let folks know, one, some of those witnesses are clustered. And so it's not just like a 15 minutes per conveyor belt we're doing here. And so I think all of our witnesses will actually have sufficient time for conversations with us. However, given how important it is to be saving time for folks near the end, I'm going to ask everyone to hold questions until each witness finishes their testimony. Which worked out really well yesterday, I thought. So thank you. Except for me. I caught on by the end. Okay. So with that, Alex, would you like to join us? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, I'm Alex Farrell, Commissioner, Department of Housing and Community Development. Really thrilled to see abundance flying around the committee table here today. Okay, I'm going to pull up. I only have 2 slides, and I'm going to try to keep my remarks fairly brief so I can open up the conversation and then turn it over to Jess from Pepsi at some point here. Okay, all right, so I'm gonna say, don't worry, I'm not gonna dive into a lot of housing data. We all know there's a shortage, so I'm not gonna bore us all with those stats. Or I might later, but I don't know. You're never boring, Maura.
Maura speaks through data better than, many.
Better than me.
She does a very good job, yeah.
Yes, she does. So just highlighting, this isn't new. This isn't news to us. This is decades of underdevelopment. What I'm showing right here is building permit data, just starting in 1980 going till now. I didn't go back further because I always, there are always imprecise measures, but this is directionally a really good measure of how we've been producing homes. This is a combination of single family homes and multifamily. You can see this split out if you want to, but I'm really just setting the scene that we've been underbuilding for a long time, since the 80s. We started to catch up in the 2000s, and then you can see the Great Recession really hit the building industry. And not only did the pace never pick back up, the industry itself never really recovered. So the labor force hasn't recovered from it. Another way to look at it, other than just building permits, and again, I'm going to give VHFA credit for all this. They maintain these various data sources into housingdata.org, so everybody has access to this. So another way to look at this data is as a percent of the existing housing stock. How much are we growing our housing stock, or how much is it changing? And so you can see as a percentage of our housing stock, we just have not kept pace since the 80s. It's been steadily declining. And since 2000, we've really just been dramatically underperforming. If you look at the housing needs assessment, or if you look at the housing targets, which was an appendix, those suggest that we need to be either doubling or tripling, depending on which you lean on more, our pace of production, given the average of the last few years. So doubling or tripling is what we need to be doing. Obviously, I'm approaching this as a housing advocate. I'm not an economist, but as a housing advocate, in order to give us a more healthy housing system for folks across the spectrum and for employers, that's what we need to be doing. So I'm going to tie this back to the CHIP tool, and that's S-127 now. So one of the big factors in limiting housing development in recent years, and what we're looking at now, is limitations of infrastructure. In prior decades, 70s and 80s, our municipalities had the bandwidth and the financial capacity to front the cost of much of this infrastructure. And we recognize now that our municipalities do not have that cost. I know there are city councilors and select board members, past or present, at this table, and that capacity does not exist at the municipal level right now. So we're trying to find tools, various tools, that we can provide municipalities to do this. And when I talk about housing and the advocacy that I'm talking about here, it's housing of all types. So you're going to hear me advocate for manufactured homes. I'd love to see more manufactured home communities, single families and duplexes. You'll hear my department talk a lot about missing middle designs, which is infill and small scale development, up to 4-unit multi-unit dwellings. multifamily condos and ownership opportunities in multifamily buildings, and you're going to hear me talk about multifamily rental. That's going to be big A, affordable housing, which we desperately need. That's going to be market rate. It's going to be targeted towards the middle income. All of these are what we need. So a tool like CHIP has an opportunity to serve all of those. Oftentimes you'll hear me, Maura, Polly, all these other housing advocates who administer programs try to design or very specifically focus some of our programs on particular types of that housing spectrum because they're programs that are going investment directly into the units. And so we can target the investment that way. CHIP is a little different because what we're talking about here is an infrastructure financing tool. So we're trying to enable all of those things so that then our programs can come in behind them and the programs can then target and dictate exactly what types of units are in there and then support the units that way. So we need to be careful with a tool like CHIP not to try to solve every problem within the criteria and the requirements of the tool. So if we're looking at this data and we know there's a housing shortage, the benefit we're getting for something like this is the new infrastructure. The benefit we're getting is the new units, the new housing units. So that's the public benefit we're trying to incent with a tool like this, which is slightly, I won't say different, but it's just a different approach to the same end from my other programs that directly fund the units. So if we rely on those other mechanisms, those other, whether it's permitting or our land use tools or designation programs that are again in my shop or the direct investments from programs, and we let those tools continue to guide the development and then allow this to just be another tool layered on there, then we can allow those other tools to do their job and allow this to incent the creation of those units via this infrastructure. So I'll get specific on a couple pieces that you've looked at in S127 in the CHIP section here. One of them is the location criteria. So, one of the benefits of this, right now, my department is very much on the future land use mapping as a part of the new Act 250 jurisdiction set out in Act 181. As a result of that, we are trying to guide municipalities to find ways to best benefit from the new Act 250 jurisdiction. That includes expanding areas that may be eligible for Tier 1A and 1B. So there will be many areas, and I think of Southern Vermont, I think of the NEK, where you could perhaps have parcels or a section of a municipality that would be eligible for Tier 1A or 1B, but they won't be included in this first phase of future land use mapping because they don't have this infrastructure yet. So this is a mechanism for us to get those municipalities that missing piece so that these other parcels can be incorporated in the future land use mapping and perhaps be captured as a planned growth area or some other aspect that will enable the benefits that some of our larger towns are going to get because they already have the infrastructure. So we don't want to accidentally exclude someone from this because they don't have the infrastructure only because that, by the fact of that's missing. So that's my case for making sure Tier 2 is fully included in this. And again, I'm leaning on those other tools that we have to do sort of the land use guidance. So let those tools do their job. Let this be an incentive for the infrastructure. By those other tools, I mean these housing projects and various other projects, they have to already go through the local zoning, go through the various A&R and state permitting, and they need to go through, in many cases, federal permitting. As for there's been a discussion as it's gone committee to committee, and how do you make sure that there is an inclusionary component or that this also serves low income housing as well as middle income housing? Is it a requirement? Is there an additional incentive? What I'll say is I'm going to make the case for not making it a requirement. I like the idea of there being an additional incentive, but again, I defer to the people that have to administer the program as to whether that's possible. As for making an inclusionary component a requirement of this program, again, I go back to let's not try to solve every problem with this tool. Let's enable this tool for everyone and then continue to guide our resources, my CDBG, VHFA LIHTC dollars, or VHCB. Let's guide those into these projects that that will then benefit from not only CHIP, but also these other things. The reason I say that is, and others can speak to this more eloquently than me, there is a substantial monitoring and compliance burden that comes with income restrictions. It is not simple, and especially depending on the life of these CHIP TIFs, it may be an extended period of time where you need to monitor and apply these. And you know, agencies that have programs that do that, we have sufficient staff. We have substantial staff that oversee the monitoring and compliance of this. So a tool like CHIP, which is really, you're trying to incent the infrastructure, the per unit benefit that you're getting, especially if it's going to be a combined, maybe a portion of this isn't housing, 30% of it is going towards some municipal infrastructure or some retail or something, and then the rest is housing. You're not getting a big bang for the buck that is going to make it possible for you to easily monitor compliance on those units. So I don't know that this is the tool to require.
Waiting till the end.
Say that again.
Can you say that
Can you
again?
run that through again? I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
Sure. So there's been a discussion of should there be an inclusionary component of this? Should 20% of the housing have to serve folks low and moderate income? That comes with a lot of, that's not easy to monitor and make sure that people are actually complying with that, especially for an extended period of time. There are other tools and investments that can make sure that a certain number of units are affordable. I don't think this is the incentive that it makes sense to make such a requirement. I believe it came to you with an increased incentive for low and moderate. Not being someone who administers that may be fine. I don't know. You'll hear from BEPC soon. They may say that that's possible to monitor. I think that makes sense. What the angle I'm coming at this from is I want all types of housing developments to benefit from this, not only those that are going to have the big A affordable. I think of Winston Prouty, for example. The Winston Prouty project isn't going to have big A affordable, but they're going to have affordable housing types at different income levels.
And Commissioner Farrell, we can talk about administration with the folks who are going to administer this. I would love if you could just be clear about sort of how this fits into the portfolio of other work that you're doing at the state.
Just ask one thing.
No,
When people say we or they or whatever, I need to know who, because
Yes.
I don't know.
Thank you.
That's-
Okay,
That's
great.
my
Thank you.
question.
thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking me for that.
Sure. So anyway, where I look at CHIP is an opportunity to expand housing at all levels. That's why I say keep this broad. Don't try to solve every problem in the criteria with CHIP. Make sure it's applicable to the parties that are going to add units to our housing stock. Maybe I'll stop there because I think that summarizes the meat of my comments.
So the question that I have, and then I'll go to other people's comments, is you have other programs, as does ANR, for infrastructure projects. There's one in this bill with the bond bank. We had a significant amount of ARPA money that went towards infrastructure funding. How is this duplicative, not duplicative, fit into that broader work that you all are thinking about, and communities' desire and or ability to access said money? I know that was a problem with the ARPA dollars.
Sure. Yeah, the ARPA dollars, and again, ANR would be better equipped to speak to this because we don't run any direct infrastructure dollars out of my department. But what I can say is the ARPA dollars were hard to access, obviously, because of timeline and other compliance pieces. As far as ANR funding, such as the state revolving fund, again, I think that's another situation where we've designed our systems in a way that only certain municipalities can benefit from them. So certain designation requirements, they need to, check the boxes of certain criteria. Again, where I think this tool fits in is this is going to be community led. This is the municipality taking the lead. And, certainly the program that we proposed for funding is going to go to the bond bank. The municipality will be making an application. But again, I think we at our department, we try to make sure that there are tools for communities of all sizes that can access a really complex tool. So Burlington, Berry, Bennington might be able to access a really complex tool. Roxbury might not be able to access a really complex tool. So I'll also say the funding that is proposed to go to the Vermont Bond Bank for infrastructure, that's going to be fairly limited. I believe the last I saw it's at 7.5 million. Again, the most equipped communities are going to get in first and get that funding first. I don't want only those communities to get to benefit from expansion when we know it's rural Vermont that's really hurting in a lot of ways.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Representative Odie Wazazak.
So, you have the idea that this is community led, but you have tools for all sizes. So, and before you said you have sufficient staff. So I'm trying to understand if a community decides we're gonna go forward with something and the developer comes and they're gonna look at a plan and so forth. Do you have people like architects and landscape architects, people who can help so that what is built in the vernacular of the community that it's being put into, so it doesn't just, you don't just drive by Vermont towns and suddenly there's these rectangular things that don't look like Vermont and don't look like the rest of the town. So you can help with that?
So you're saying in the case that somebody applies to one of my existing
No,
programs?
I'm wondering, I don't know. I'm wondering if towns are gonna get help when they are sitting down across from a developer and they would like more housing. Who's gonna help them? Expertise on how to do this, and you. Do you help with that?
So I'll say a couple of things. The first is, as a housing advocate, I get a little bit wary when we start talking about things like making sure things look like Vermont or still feel like Vermont. I totally understand what you're describing, but we need to make sure that we are enabling. If a community wants to enable or allow a certain housing type, and it may be a multifamily building that is new in their community, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, what I'll say in addition to that, this community planning revitalization team in my department does assist communities with their code, with their zoning. We've released the Guide for Great Neighborhoods, which does provide communities with the tools to make sure whatever development they are seeking to enable, they're comfortable with it and they're happy with it. That could take a lot of different forms. Winooski's been really, really successful with their form-based code. I think a lot of Vermonters love Winooski and love to go to Winooski. And then, we've seen towns like Shelburne or Manchester take different approaches. We will provide funding and resources so they can make the decision themselves, including municipal planning grants.
So you help that, municipal planning would help them when they're sitting across from the developer to have the support they need to be able to even voice, to even consider what there is. To ask for it. That's what I'm concerned about.
Sure. I wouldn't say that we're never going to get involved unless we're funding a project. We're almost never going to get involved in negotiations between a town and a developer.
All right, that's Glenn. Thank you.
Thanks. Representative Wazazak.
Thank you. So the first time I read through this bill, one thing that stuck out to me was that requirement for 70% of the gross floor area of the project to be dedicated to housing. And then, Betsy would approve that if it meets all the other criteria. And if it's meets all the other criteria, but it's below 70%, it goes to this new CHIP board. Standing up a board to just do one thing, always going to be pause. But, I think the chair brought up a concern yesterday, which since the impact this would have on the education fund is important, not simply having a carte blanche. Every housing project, across the state, regardless of its parameters, can qualify for this program. So my question is, do you think that there is a minimum that could be applied? For example, 50% of the gross floor area being housing. If we go below 50%, should we really be using this tool to finance a project that's not a majority housing? I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that section, on that concept. As from your department's perspective.
Thank you. I think it's a great question. The reason I wouldn't set a minimum is because there are a lot of different types of projects in very different communities in Vermont. And municipalities might envision something very different where there is going to be a substantial housing project that's going to benefit from this, but it may not because there's a municipal building or part of some other amenity that's going to be part of this. gross floor area may not work out to be, a certain, whatever we set out now. So I wouldn't set a minimum. And I think of a lot of downtowns where there's going to be a requirement in the zoning that, say the first floor is retail or sometimes more. So that's why I hesitate, because I want to enable those to move forward and the rest of the building to become housing as well. I see a lot of reuse opportunities with this program. So I don't want to, that's one of the restrictions I don't want to layer on, because it's already going to have the check of the municipality as a part of the negotiation. VEPC is a part of the negotiation. There are several layers of oversight. And now, with this other board, to make sure that this is a project that's contributing to the housing goals and the other goals of the community.
I've heard the example of like a school, an old school that's being renovated where there's a big gymnasium there. And they want to leave the gymnasium as a gymnasium as like an amenity for the folks who live in the new housing units in that school. But I just also think that there is a minimum right now. There's 70%. There's just a carve out for it. And I'm just trying to think of if there's a delta between the 70% and what our floor should be in that carve out. To allow. So thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Representative Brannigan, and then Odie, and then we are going to wrap up. I really asked Commissioner Farrell to share, and then, ask Commissioner Farrell to really share like big picture, how this fits into his agency's work, department, sorry.
Yes.
And any administration questions we can take on with BEPC. So Representative.
I heard you say 7.5 million. What does that 7.5 million do? And my second question is, why does this need to come out of the ed fund?
So you're talking about the Senate report, which is a proposed appropriation of one-time funding to go to the Vermont Bond Bank to support what we're calling the Vermont Infrastructure Sustainability Fund. So that fund, if the budget passes and that gets appropriated to the bond bank, will be used to support various types of infrastructure that will serve housing. So that could be water and wastewater, an extension or expansion. It could also serve transportation infrastructure. So oftentimes zoning or designation areas will require sidewalk connections and other capital improvements as a part of a housing project. So it could go to serve that. In that case, again, the municipality is the applicant, but
It's a revolving fund?
it is a revolving
Okay,
fund.
it's a revolving fund. So you're asking us to propose to the powers that be that we set aside 7.5 million to do this? Is that what you're asking us?
That's a general fund appropriation. That's separate from this.
Is it in the bill yet? The big bill?
It is in the big bill, yes.
Perfect.
Hmm.
Right? Okay. And how does it relate to this project?
How does it relate? They're unrelated, except for that they could both serve infrastructure.
They're both in the bill that's before us, and they both are designed to support infrastructure for housing.
Okay, and ed fund, how did the ed fund get involved?
I think that's a question for someone else as to how the CHIP program was designed and thought of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Odie and then Holcomb.
I heard you say, reuse, and I'm thinking 10 years from now when the bonds pay off. What do you think we should be concerned about 10 years from now when the bond is paid off, what reuse do you mean reuse about that?
So when I use the term reuse, I mean reuse of buildings. So I think of Bennington High School.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So, and so do you have a concern about reuse of how buildings will be used once the bond is paid off? What have you thought about that?
If it's still serving housing, I'm happy. I desperately need, and I guess, thank you. That's a good transition to maybe the overarching comments that Madam Chair asked for. My concern is adding housing units and giving municipalities the opportunity to lead and enable housing. We've been asking a lot of our municipalities, if you look at, there's been a great deal of focus on, we've taken the housing needs assessment, and then as a result of the Home Act and Act 181, we were asked to set housing targets, bring those targets down at a regional level and now the municipal level. So a great deal of my focus right now is giving municipalities the tools to meet those. Because right now, my communities, when I go and visit them, they look at those and they say, that sounds great. I don't know how I'm going to do that. I need a sewer line to go another half a mile if I'm going to do that, so I can get to this pasture that I know I can use. I need this building in the heart of our downtown to be upgraded, but there's so much infrastructure that goes into that. So given that that's my focus right now, I'm talking as a housing advocate. I see this as a great tool to give those municipalities what they need. Thank you.
Welcome. Yeah. I think, by the way, it was the governor who introduced the idea of using the ed fund when he did his initial rollout of recommendation on CHIP. But my question actually has to do with just the capacity of the state to build these projects. And part of what I'm hearing in my area is, great, who's going to do the work? Because there isn't enough work. And so I raise that because previously we've heard from you about the power of targeting, of saying, here's where the jobs are. Let's target the infrastructure where the need is greatest. Right now, we can deal with other projects as we have the resources. But do you think that there is a risk here in that by dispersing the impact on development, we're going to tell a lot of people they have money to do things that then they can't hire people to do, or because there's so much competing demand, the cost is quickly going to become quite unsustainable? Or are there ways that as we look at this bill, we could think about targeting these resources to get better value for dollars for Vermonters quickly to address that critical housing need? Because I think we all agree we're in a housing crisis, but we can't do everything all at the same time. Where are we going to make the biggest difference?
I think it's an important question. Thank you. I mean, one thing that we're really focused on right now is, where does the future land use mapping play into our investments? And I think this will naturally fall into that structure because we have done a good job of using our other tools, our permitting, our mapping efforts, as well as other incentives that come from my team, such as the designated areas, and trying to redefine and target those. That I don't see this tool being something that will disperse efforts, by the very nature of the fact that all of our other systems are already geared to sort of target, these areas where there are going to be resources. Now, if a community like Fairhaven has an opportunity to redevelop a parcel that's underutilized right now, and maybe it falls outside of an area that's currently mapped for a planned growth area or a designated area, but it's on a corridor where people are traveling from, one point to another, I want to enable that. So I see this as a tool to, I don't see this as creating a risk of dispersing. What I also see, though, is we need to continue to put tools on the table that will enable the housing growth while we do the other work to increase our workforce. I don't want us to pause right now, and that's a really hard thing to say because I know my friends at Labor are working really hard to find tools, same with DED, to increase the labor force. So I don't want to pause in the meantime while those efforts work to succeed.
And how do you adjust, how do we account for the fact that property taxes are a part of the cost of housing? And this is a potentially, we don't know what the impact is on property taxes, but as written, it's potentially quite significant. How do we weigh that against the kind of dispersed development that you're contemplating, Chip?
What I see as a benefit, maybe the primary benefit of a tool like this, whether it was Spark or now CHIP, is to enable growth in the grand list and growth in the tax base. And really that's our greatest way to curb the potentially catastrophic effects we're facing if we look at the 2040s and what we may see in population decline. Our greatest tool to curb that right now is to add housing to our housing stocks, so that our grand list is growing now and can withstand what we're about to see in terms of population and workforce decline in the 2040s. So I'm really encouraging my communities to get out in front of this because it could be potentially catastrophic if we don't make the investments now that 10 or 15 years from now, could be maybe saving us.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Jessica, do you want to join us?
Thank you. And is John joining us via Zoom, or is he not able to?
He's not able to
Okay,
join
great.
us today, but he does say hello to the committee, and
Last week.
we saw him last week. And yeah, he is, as you know, the VEPC board is a volunteer board, so they all have full-time jobs with full-time responsibilities. So,
You're welcome to sit up there or stay on the bench, whatever works better for you.
so I'll just introduce myself. So for the record, I'm Jessica Hartleben. I'm the Executive Director for the Vermont Economic Progress Council. And I am here today to talk about CHIP. I do also have the other half of the VEPSI staff with me today, Ellie Beckett. She is the program manager, and Ellie manages the day-to-day operations of the TIFs that we currently manage at VEPSI. So if there are specific questions relating to the day-to-day oversight and administration of TIF, I'm going to rely on Ellie's expertise because she is the one that is literally in the spreadsheets, if you will, every day. So thank you so much for the opportunity to have me present to you today. And I really do appreciate that I'm here to be here in person. I do have some written remarks that I can present to you. I did listen to your questions yesterday. I'm happy to answer your questions. And if there are questions that I can't answer, I'm also happy to try to provide you a written response by tomorrow if I am able to do that. So again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I really appreciate all of your work, but also the building's work this session to find solutions to housing, particularly for the rural communities. At VEPSI, we also share this same urgency and appreciate your focus on looking at these issues. We are really excited to be a part of this solution to the CHIP program. And we believe that we can administer VEPSI with VEPSI's expertise, manage and administer this program effectively with some targeted adjustments. So I'm just going to cut right to the targeted adjustments that we see where language could potentially be strengthened in the bill as it is currently drafted. The first section is in the affordability language. As the bill is currently drafted, it's beyond VEPSI's authority to enforce those income-based eligibility requirements, especially if it's designed to be done in perpetuity or for significant 30 to 40 years. It's important to ensure that a program is sufficiently flexible to allow for a range of housing while also being feasible to administer. VEPSI needs, or Vermont needs, more housing of all types. We support the Senate and House Economic Committee versions of the bill, which focus on low to moderate income Vermonters, while empowering municipalities to bring forward projects that they're going to know meet the community's needs without relying on very narrowly defined criteria. VEPSI's job, and I take this responsibility very seriously, is to uphold the purpose of CHIP in our project reviews and in our work with communities to ensure that CHIP reflects the local needs of the municipalities, but also meets equity so that we're applying this across all communities in Vermont. The second is the location criteria. CHIP should allow small rural towns to benefit from this tax increment financing tool. Typically, in TIF districts, we've only seen it benefit the larger communities in Vermont. To ensure that municipalities have an opportunity to use CHIP, we would support restoring the Tier 2 eligibility criteria as passed in the Senate and House Economic Development Committees. In addition, CHIP would allow for a community like Fairhaven to unlock the tax increment financing tool. Given the restrictions in the Big TIF program, Rutland County is no longer eligible to have any TIF programming for the next probably 20 years. Because under the current TIF statute, each county is only allowed to have 2 TIF districts. So using CHIP in Rutland County in particular could be extremely beneficial for other communities and municipalities that will not have access to TIF for approximately 20+ years. The next issue we would like you to consider is the housing floor area. BEPC can verify the percentage of floor area dedicated to the intended use at the time of the application through applicant attestations and also through its review of architectural and other development plans. However, BEPC would recommend that the CHIP board and VEPC be granted authority to develop a process should the municipalities need to come back to VEPC for a substantial change to their original CHIP project. This would be important in the unlikely event that housing floor areas might require modifications, and there are circumstances that often evolve that are beyond the control of the municipality and the developer from the time that the infrastructure is built to the time that the housing development commences that may require some modifications. We want to make sure that we are meeting your legislative intent while also balancing the uniqueness of these infrastructure and housing development projects. Based on our experience with TIF, there are key project elements like floor area allocations that could shift due to market conditions, construction costs, and development timelines. It's really important that there is some flexibility around this to make sure that the projects remain feasible and viable. And then the last area that I would ask you to consider would be the permitting. Given the rigorous permitting processes and associated costs involved in the development of housing in Vermont and infrastructure in Vermont, the requirement under Section 1910E that requires all permits to be secured at the time of application could have some unintended consequences. Specifically, it could discourage early stage projects and smaller developers from applying to CHIP because investing in permitting without a certainty of receiving financing for the critical infrastructure that needs to happen before these development projects get off the ground present financial risks that need to be mitigated. The requirement that all permits be secured at the time of application negates the need for the language in the bill that currently says the current stage of the permitting process to be included in the reporting requirements. That seems to be contradictory. We're confident that with these minor adjustments and also with your legislative direction, that VEPC can carry out this program effectively and in full alignment with the legislature's goals. We look forward to coming back every year and giving you updates. And we're going to do that every January. And then we're also going to give you a big report in 10 years. And we're going to, I think, this might not be in this version of the bill, but at one point we were going to give you an update at a 5-year mark.
That is still in the bill.
Okay, so you're going to be seeing my face a lot in the next 10 years. And it's really my hope that we will be able to administer this program within the guardrails that you have set forth and with your direction. And then we are able to be basically able to come back to you with technical tweaks based on what we're seeing in the communities. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, and I understand I may not be able to answer them fully today, but I do look forward to working with the legislature and the CHIP board moving forward so that we can bring these projects to all communities in Vermont.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I just want to request that for specific authority that you're asking for in the bill, if you want to send recommended language on that, that would be helpful.
Sure.
If you don't feel like you have authority to develop rules on substantial changes, for instance.
I think we have the ability to do that under the rulemaking authority. I think it's just going to be important, especially because the way that I understand the rule is currently configured is that if a project is under 70% of the gross area floor plan, it needs to go to the chipboard. But that if a project were to come to VEPSI and it is over 70% and the infrastructure project gets off the ground, but then as we saw with COVID, and with, other construction costs, if a project cannot meet that 70% of the gross area floor plan requirement, it would seem to me that VEPSI and the chipboard would then need to have a review of that, because the chipboard has to evaluate whether, if the floor plan is under 70%, whether that is meaningfully supporting the community's housing needs. So,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Representative Feltes.
Yes, I'm wondering if you feel there needs to be some form of the but-for concept in this particular proposal. And I'm concerned about the rural areas, just as you are, because I'm thinking of a very, not so small, my town is 5,000 people, but a rural area in which, yes, we could certainly use an extension of the water lines and the sewer lines in order to do something, but it may be prohibitively expensive to do that, and so for a developer to do that. And so do we need to say this development is not going to happen unless we actually can get this development in there?
right.
So the but-for sort of thing, it wouldn't happen anyway.
Sure. So I think that there has been a lot of testimony in both the Senate and the House on the reason that the quote unquote strict but-for test was taken out of the CHIP legislation. And I think that the reason is that we are in a severe housing crisis and severe housing shortage. And so that the but-for test has been ultimately proven because we are in such a crisis situation. And that it is evident based on data that we have received from the Department of Taxes that new construction, so when we look at the grand list growth based on new construction, that has been either stagnant or declining for the last 20 years at a rate of 1% or less. And so I think that while I'm not the policymaker here, I'm just the administrator of the program that you create, I think that other advocates have made that case that due to this housing crisis we find ourselves in, and based on the data, that the but-for has been proven here.
So it's not a necessary winnowing of potential projects.
I don't think that is going to help the issue alleviate a very dire housing crisis that advocates have been raising alarm bells for in multiple committees for many months.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative.
I'm curious about the tier 2 issue that you brought up, because we have in here that is the issue with the tier 2 language, in your opinion, is the issue that the tier 2 is currently tied to permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws? Is that the problem that you're asking us to look at?
So the issue, I will be the first one to admit to you that I am not the land use housing expert. The issue that I see with tier 2 is that there are two problems. One, this was raised, I think, in House General, that VEPSI could approve a project in a tier 2 location if it looks like it would become eligible for tier 1 when the improvements improvements funded in the housing infrastructure project are complete. I'm not sure how VEPSI would administer that.
Thank you for saying that, because I can't figure that out either.
Yeah, that was the.
I don't know how that VEPSI could make that determination. I think that removing barriers to access a program so that we can apply and administer the program consistently is going to be really helpful for VEPSI council when they're looking at these projects to administer.
Yeah, I appreciate that too, because I do share the goal of, downtown Barry has it. This is, this tool could help us in other theoretical ways, but I think that getting this tool into the smaller rural towns that might not have permanent zoning or subdivision bylaws is a worthy.
One of the other
Separate from the
concerns,
administrative.
yeah, one of the other concerns that was raised, I think, in House General was what if VEPSI does make that determination, but then at the end, it goes to LURB. I think LURB is the right way.
Yeah.
And LURB says, no, you're not eligible for tier one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to hear you say you are approval of your some concern and maybe a 5-year check back would be good as well. And the vice chair and I just had a conversation with the chair of general housing. He's also concerned about, I think is it a 1 year now and then a 10-year?
It's 1 year and 10-year right now. I think 5-year got also thrown back in. And I will tell you that I actually testified about this program reporting requirements in Senate Finance. And the reason that I suggested a 10-year sort of come back in 10 years and let's look at how the program is working is because based on what we see in regular TIF, it takes about 5 years just for infrastructure projects to be created and to get completed before any private development can occur. So when I looked at the reporting requirements that your colleagues thought would be really important for me to report back on, I would not have that data to give you. I'm not going to know how many housing units have been created necessarily in 5 years because the communities might still be building out the infrastructure that would then provide the opportunity to create those housing units. So while I'm coming back every year, like I do with Big TIF, we provide you, this committee in particular, approximately a 60-page TIF report every year that is chock full of a lot of information that you request about how TIF is working in those municipalities that have it. In addition to that, we also do monitoring visits. We do 2 monitoring visits a year where myself and Ellie go out to the municipalities. We invite your committee in particular to the fall monitoring visits to review how communities are doing and how they're utilizing their TIF dollars. And then we have annual reports that the communities have to provide to us that are the basis for that TIF legislative report. So I don't want to just write a report for the sake of writing a report and have it say there's nothing I can provide to you because the housing projects haven't been started yet.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, I think one of my concerns and maybe others as well is, it's kind of unlimited right now, right? The program. So, as the chair said, we're pretty responsible for the education finance piece of it. And I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to, whether it's yearly, which you said you're going to come back with a report every year.
Sure am. Yep.
It's important to see how many towns and so on take advantage of this.
Right.
And I don't know what the provisions would be fairly to put a stop to it if we get to a point where we are concerned, and I want to maybe try to have something in there in advance of that, but.
I think that you as the legislature could do that and that there are a lot of guardrails that are already in place. And one of the pieces that might come back to you would be me saying, we have 250 new applications. VEPSI is a staff of 2. That's not possible. You can't administer 250 of them. So I think that might be a great question to have in the future if it comes to that. But just based on what we have seen with TIF, my understanding is that TIF was limited back in 2013 to only having 6 districts created. And there have only been 2 successful TIF districts created since 2013. So I think that while we might fear that we are opening the floodgates. I think if we look at the data from our other TIP program, we might feel a little comfort in that this may or may not have the floodgate opening that we fear.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh,
Can I just follow on that?
I'd actually rather you didn't.
Okay.
But we can have you speak quickly at the end, if
Great.
you don't mind. Thank you. Representative Burkhardt.
So how many projects do you think you can effectively administer? You said 250 is too many, but do you have a sense, we're struggling a little bit with, we tried to ask the JFO sort of model for us. How big do you think this program could be and what could be the impact on the education fund? Trying to think about big picture, what the size of it could be. And I'm really struggling to get a sense of what your intuition is or data shows might be some parameters around the program.
So thank you for that question. And I think there are two separate issues going on there. The first is VEPC's capacity to administer the program. And then the second is more of a policy and theoretical question around the ed fund. I don't want to mix up the two or commingle them because they're very different questions. So I think in terms of VEPC's capacity, we have the capacity to get this program off the ground. And I would like to have the flexibility to be able to come back to you and say, here's what we need to effectively administer a program with the guardrails that you've put on. I'm not going to be able to speculate about what that's going to look like until I see some applications coming into the council for review. And I think it would be premature or speculative for me to guess. And again, I'm coming back to you every year. And I think that is an effective guardrail to say to you, if I come back to you in 2 years and say, our capacity is maxed out. We need some help. We're at capacity. That's fair. VEPC administers a program. We don't make policy choices. And I don't want to get into the policy choice that you are now grappling with about whether it takes from the ed fund or not. I think that those are policy decisions that we're not going to be able to sit around and solve at this table today.
Can I just ask
Yeah, you can, folks, we have like 9 more minutes here. And I also just want to offer that I think this body, future bodies, past bodies, never put the horse back in the barn, let the horse out of the barn. Your follow-up question.
So my follow-up question is, you mentioned a couple of times the guardrails that you were putting around it. I'm struggling a little. Can you help me articulate? If somebody comes to me and says, what are the guardrails that we have put around this program? Can you help me articulate this clearly? Because I don't really have a good bullet point list in my.
Sure. So I might bring Ellie up to talk a little bit about the guardrails around Big Tip, but I can tell you that just under CHIP is a very transparent and public process. So if I am a municipality, I am creating a project. I have to get approval from my municipal body in order for me to go forward with this process. So that's guardrail number 1, that you have to go to your community and get support from your community before you're even thinking about coming to VEPC. Then once you get your legislative body approval, you're bringing an application to VEPC. And that application, as it is outlined in the statute, has many requirements, including location requirements, floor plan requirements, types of housing requirements. The intent is primary housing. You've provided guardrails about the types of improvements that VEPSI can authorize and the costs that can be associated with those improvements. That's another guardrail.
Representative,
I could go on, but yeah. Go ahead.
Representative Burkhardt, you,
I'm good, I'm good.
Representative Maslin and then Holcomb.
Yeah, thank you. Early on in your testimony, you were talking about what is were unwelcome restrictions.
Unintended consequences?
Well, it sounded like unnecessary restrictions on what you can approve or not. That's my terminology.
Sure.
Particularly, I mean, for example, 70% of, well, say, their mathematical, or let's call them mathematical language that describes what the parameters are, what the limits are.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. And you listed a bunch of them and they all make sense from Betsy's perspective. The concern that we have, and we discussed somewhere yesterday in committee is if we loosen it up a lot, what if every municipality wants to do this sort of stuff? Sort of stuff is unnecessarily casual language, but wants to do a tips. Ultimately, what's the impact on the education fund? And we're responsible for that. And that is a conflict, those two sides of things that I don't see a resolution to right now. And I'm just putting it out there.
Sure.
Because we do need, metrics have a use, right? Does it or doesn't, you know? So I'm just offering to you, if we become overly flexible, then everybody's gonna take advantage of the chips and then where are we? So that's just my comment. I don't know if there's an easy answer today, but it is something for your outfit to think about. Because we need to figure out where will the limits be? What are the restrictions? What are the metrics so that we can say, okay, we understand how this fits from our perspective.
Sure.
And that's just my thing for you guys to ponder these days.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that comment.
And I appreciate how you've been clear that you're here to administer whatever we dream up, even if it's absurd or fantastic.
I don't know if we can dream, if we can administer absurdity, but we can try.
And that the decision on sort of ed fund or not ed fund, you seem to be agnostic.
I mean, so I think that the ed fund discussion is a theoretical policy assumption, right? And I think that policy assumption from all of what I've heard in the building and what I've heard from others is that it's based on a notion that the development would have occurred anyway, in the same location without TIP. And VEPSI doesn't get into that. VEPSI is tasked with determining whether a project can move forward and is financially viable to move forward based on real world, fact-driven, very specific decisions. And I just want to be clear, 2 members of this building serve on the VEPSI council and help guide those decisions.
Thank you. Representative Holcomb, get the last question.
So much, and I appreciate your thoughtful response. So I'm going to ask you for a little bit more help again. And part of it is I come from the same region as Representative Maslin, where we've seen extremely strong grand list growth that has absolutely nothing to do with development. And intent is just language. So I'm hoping you can just give us again some specific guardrails that you think we can add to CHIP so that we can have some confidence that this isn't just another case of using school budgets to subsidize more second homes, more ski villages, more Airbnbs, more investment properties in a small handful of communities, because that's what we've seen in some of our communities.
Right. Thank you for that. I'm not sure where are you both in the Burlington
Windsor,
area?
no, we're in
Windsor?
Windsor,
Okay.
Orange too.
Okay, so I think what I would say is that the purpose language is connected to one of the decision-making points that VEPSI has to make. So right now, the only way that VEPSI can approve a decision about whether a CHIP project goes forward is if it's meeting with the purpose language,
Right.
which is outlined in 1907. So the only way that VEPSI could approve a project would be if the primary purpose of the housing is for a low to moderate income household. And for this version of the bill has further defined what low to moderate income household is. And I believe in House General, they tried to define what a primary residence is. I think it's using the bona fide domicile. Again, those are curious policy decisions that you will continue to grapple with and that we will come back to you and say, obviously a ski chalet is not going to be a primary residence. Ski chalets can only happen in certain communities, and that the intent, as I have heard throughout this building from the beginning, is to address the more rural communities where there is not going to be opportunity for big ski chalets to be located. And I would also just ask you to think about if these are primary residences, there is also data from the Department of Labor, which I believe is from 2022 or 2023, that shows that in Vermont, the majority of Vermonters are making $50,000 or less, given the high number of service industry jobs we have here. And so if we are going to create housing for Vermonters, which is what everyone wants here, we need to think about not just the housing that's the McMansions or whatever, the fears behind that, but the reality that in order to build housing for Vermonters, we have to understand that most Vermonters are living with salaries that are $50,000 or less.
Thank you
Very welcome.
so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Very helpful.
Good luck.
Thank you. Good luck. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Yes, please come sit in the chair for a quick moment, Brett. I just know there are so many people around the room, and if I start letting commentary from the sidelines, it could get away from us a little bit.
I just have one quick thought, and it's to try to address a couple of the representatives' questions. I'm Brett Long. I'm the interim commissioner of the Department of Economic Development. And we've been involved in this concept for a long time, years and years, the idea of project-based TIP. And so we've been listening to the arguments for a long, long time. And as a taxpayer and the interim commissioner of the Department of Economic Development, I'd ask you to think about the questions you raised about guidelines from the opposite direction. Commissioner Farrell showed a graph that showed how much housing hasn't been built. So as a taxpayer, I'd have to ask you, what has been the cost to the Ed Fund of not building that housing over the last 10, 20 years? That's the real cost to the Ed Fund. You know, there's a trade-off as to whether somebody's going to build it anyway. But I can show you historically what the cost has actually been. I have data. So I'd just ask that you think about it the other way around.
Thank you. I'm going to offer that I think that when we look at any of these things in a diametric or bipolar way, we lose track of the nuance that's going to be required to do this well. So Thank you for that. I'm going to ask the committee to really focus on sort of the middle ground, that both things can be true at once, and we're going to manage our way through that. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Laura, thank you. And folks, we're gonna take a quick break after either Maura or Polly, not sure which.
Hi. Excuse me. Hi, I'm Maura Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Commissioner Farrell did a wonderful job with the data. He showed that we've been permitting about 2,500 homes a year. But Debbie Downer here, wah, wah, wah. We need to be doing 7,500. You've heard the numbers. We need 24,000 to 36,000 homes in the next 4 years. It's May. I can tell you we're not going to hit 7,500 this year, but we need to triple the amount of production that is happening in the state. There has been a little uptick since 2020, but even with that, we're just not doing enough. And the good news, your committee knows this. I talked to all of you in the cafeteria and at the ribbon cuttings and things like that. And I think almost all of you have approached me at some point and talked about your frustration, because you know that not only is this impacting the state's economy, which you care about when you're sitting in these chairs, but more importantly, I hear you talk about how much it's impacting your constituents. And so I appreciate how much you are passionate about housing. It's very obvious when I see copies of the abundance book being passed around and talk about, can I borrow that? Can I borrow that? Before committee started. And so I'm going to help you out. I was an adjunct at UVM for a decade, so I'm going to give you the little Cliff Notes professorial role of what that book says when it comes to housing. It's a much bigger and better book than just that. But there are 5 things that Ezra Klein's abundance agenda has as pillars. Okay, so the first one is that zoning reform is critical. Have we done zoning reform? Yeah. None of it. Yep. Are we done? But we've done a lot. Ooh, I like that answer. Okay, next one, build more housing. And he's very clear that this has to be increasing production of both market rate and subsidized. That's how we're going to meet the growing demand and reduce homelessness. Third one, the government has to be involved in affecting housing supply. There has to be greater public sector investment in production and land use policy if we're going to correct the market failures that we've been seeing. Next one, you're doing it. Invest in infrastructure. Excellent. That's what's going to support growth. And so that is critical. And the last one is that abundance and that mindset is equity. The increasing housing supply, especially in high opportunity areas, but across the state, will advance racial and economic equity by breaking down exclusionary systems. So please still read the book. Also, I don't have to give you all a lesson in good governance, because a lot of you got under this committee because you've been here a long time, but the teacher in me just wants to make sure that we're on the same page, that like what this bill is doing is what the pillars of good governance also requires, which is a clear purpose. You're working on definitions around affordable housing. I want to talk about that in a minute. And so equity and fairness, that's where I hear, I was on the Rural Caucus call this morning, and that's where I hear the some of the rural communities are questioning about if we hit that equity and fairness question with the guardrails that are necessary. And I promise I'm going to talk about guardrails in a minute. Transparency is a pillar of good governance. You got that with the annual reporting we just heard about. Accountability and oversight. We just heard about the municipal oversight, the state level VEPC oversight. I see some reporters are in the room. We had public oversight. This is not a quiet program that no one knows about. We've had great coverage of it. Efficiency and administrative simplicity. I'm hearing it's better than Big TIF, but you know, if y'all do want to come up with appropriations, you're welcome to do that too. And I think we heard about some of that happening through the bond bank. Fiscal responsibility, that's what this committee has the hard job of figuring out. It's those guardrails. Sunset and regular review, you got that in there, and public engagement and local input. That's what you're hearing from developers. That's what, when you hear from Let's Build Homes, when you hear, and I'll talk more about some surveys that have been done, loud and clear, the public has told you and us and anyone who will listen that investment in infrastructure is necessary. So hasn't gotten a lot of airtime this session, but I'm really hoping next year it does. There was a summer study committee last year when all the Act 250 reforms happened, and there were many more ways to be exempted from Act 250. The affordable housing advocates, including VHFA, we're loud and proud to say, we need to look at how our communities are incentivizing the creation of affordable housing. Because it used to be that a priority housing project, or what nerds like me call a PHP, used to have this definition of, well, it still does, has a definition of affordability. It means long-term affordability. And that's how you'd be exempted from Act 250. And that was a way that municipalities could encourage developers to build affordable housing in their communities. So when the Act 250 exemptions became available to many more, there was a study that said, how can we still support affordable housing in the state? And it's a great report that Commissioner Farrell's office led, but the Land Access Opportunity Board, VHFA, and the Housing Conservation Board all participate in. And as a part of that, we did do surveys, focus groups, specifically with developers, ask them what they needed. And, you know, drum roll, please, they need infrastructure support. It's really adding to their cost of housing. They also, when talking about why aren't you doing more affordable housing, they made it clear they need subsidy to do it. It doesn't just happen magically. If it did, we wouldn't need government intervention, but we need subsidy. And so there are recommendations in that report of how we can support affordable housing, and I'd be happy to come back, as I'm sure the others from the committee could talk about that. We know that the lack of housing is holding back our economy. We have workforce shortages, we have strain on public services, not just school enrollment, but understaffed emergency services. We have a stagnant population, aging demographics. The credit rating agencies, I know a lot of us don't read those boring S&P reports, but I promise you, they are making your job harder. When we have a low or suppressed credit rating, it makes the capital bill more expensive, it raises taxes. It may be appear to be 3 steps removed, but it is a direct impact on the state's economy. And they've been very clear as of last October again, saying that our housing shortage is costing the state money by being a challenge for the state's credit rating. The state treasurer is clear on this and others. We've lost business expansion, investment opportunities. I'm as excited as anyone about hearing about the excitement of Beta and OnLogic and these sexy new companies. I don't understand what they do, but I also have to ask how many more would have grown or stayed or developed in Vermont. We know that housing costs outpace wage growth, and we know that there are regional inequalities in growth and opportunity. I've heard this committee ask the question of, but do we really need it? And I really appreciate the chair's push to say not everything's a binary and that this is a continuum and that we should look to say, you know, sometimes it's really needed, sometimes it's not. So I am a financial VHFA, the F is finance. So I'm used to reading finance reports, and often we've all seen it in our statements from any investments we have, which is that past performance is no indication of future success or outcomes, right? And yet, how does all of us make financial decisions? We look at the Morningstar reports, we look at what happened over the last 3, 5, 10 years, and we judge accordingly. We don't just look in the rearview mirror.
But when you say all of us, do you mean like people in your position or all of us with our personal banking accounts? Because I certainly don't make financial decisions.
Okay. So it is hard to have a crystal ball and to say for certain what is going to happen. We talked, I should have kind of started with this. I guess when I sat down and my title was Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and if you know that we're a 50-year-old mission-based affordable housing lender, then you probably knew how the next 10 minutes of your life was going to pan out. I was going to sit here and I was going to tell you all about housing and how that can solve all the world's problems. But as Alex joked before he spoke, before I had a job in housing, we can go back to day one. I was a data nerd. Like that core value of accountability, I could tell you about my childhood, but like that came early. Okay. So I think often I have brilliant ideas. And I don't trust them always until I can see if the data reinforces it, or to check with other smarter people who work at VHFA to see if these are good ideas. You need some kind of accountability in that way. And so good governance and what we're all, not just going with what we want, but also what the data proves. And we can, I just heard VEPC said that only 2 TIFs have been created in the last decade. And when I do look at all the data over the last 20 years, what I see is that over the last 15 years, we've had maybe never to return low interest rates that spurred a lot of housing investment. There was a spike in inflation in the last 5 years. So that inflationary spike, we probably saw a lot of housing investment. 20 years ago, we had a much younger workforce. The construction industry was younger. There was more support for it that has gone in the wrong direction over the last 20 years. So I don't know what the future holds, but I know that 20 years ago was a much better environment for housing creation. And so I'm nervous that if 20 years ago was the heyday and we had low interest rates and we had a better, well, not better workforce, a younger workforce, more workforce, lower inflation, all that, I can tell you the last 20 or 30 years has only given us 1/3 of the housing that we need. So I don't like short trend lines like, oh, in the pandemic, everyone moved to Vermont and that's going to continue forever. Like 1, 2, 3 year trend lines. Vermont's so small, I'm a little suspicious of them. That accountability in me doesn't get too worked up about that. But when I look at 20 or 30 years of statewide data, I start getting worried that in the heyday, we still weren't building 1/3 of what we needed. So the last thing I want to talk about is guardrails. There were questions about what are these guardrails. VEPC started walking through what some of the structural guardrails to the system are. I'm not the administrator, so that's not my bailiwick. I know that some of the policy conversations that VHFA has been a part of in the Senate and then in Commerce and House General were one around mixed income housing. And VHFA is very clear that we do believe that the majority of the benefit of CHIP should be for housing. That is critical. So at one point, committees were actually looking at a less than 50% percentage. And we were very clear, we thought it should be at least 60%. I understand now the bill is up to 70%. I hope it's clear that we do need mixed use buildings. So we always need some kind of, it shouldn't be 100% for housing. But having the majority of that for housing is critical. I know that affordability and the definition of that has been another guardrail. Should this be limited to just affordable housing? Well, the purpose makes clear that it is limited to low and moderate income housing. And I'm all for that and that definition. I get nervous about when the definition of that includes longevity, meaning 15, 20 years of affordability. That, by defining affordable housing as affordable for the long term, it really limits how many housing developments are going to be able to take advantage of this tool. So we need 7,500 homes a year. We're building 2,500 now, maybe 3,000 in a top year. Pre-ARPA money, pre-pandemic, we were building about 300 affordable homes a year, government subsidized affordable homes. So you've taken a guardrail of being worried that everyone's going to take advantage of this down to something that one might call more like a machete, and we went from a guardrail to something like the eye of a needle. And so I like the idea of defining the low and moderate benefit as is in the purpose as some kind of income limitation, but it's that ongoing monitoring and the longevity is what tips it into saying you can only have housing promised to be affordable for 15, 20 years, if there's been subsidy, if there's the kind of oversight that VHFA and others play in monitoring units. And so I am happy that affordable housing, though, will be able to take advantage of this benefit. They will be a participant in it, and I think it'll help. And if you want to invite me back or tell me to go down to House General and talk more about how the state, or I'll go to appropriations maybe, talk more about how the state can support affordable housing. I have a lot of ideas of that, spurred by that PHP study that was done last year. And so I also really support the idea of this being a primary residence. I understand it's now called something domicile. That is important that we focus on primary residences, knowing that 16, 17% of our state are not primary residences. At one point, there was a requirement that it always be a primary residence and that be monitored constantly. And I just have to say, if you're going to do that, you got to have appropriations to monitor that because that's a full-time job. And so the last thing, another guardrail that's been discussed has been geographic limitations. This year it's been discussed in terms of tier 1A, tier 1B, tier 2. And that's where I know I hear how much the Rural Caucus wants to make sure that their communities have the ability to progress from one tier to the next. And they see this as a tool. And for equity reasons, they don't want to be left out of an exciting tool that can help support housing development. That's my testimony. I'm happy to answer questions.
I have a fairly tiny detail question and then it means it's a hard one. It was really not. The working group tests the new, what's it called?
The chipboard.
The chipboard.
Yep.
Do you like have time for that?
Feelings.
Does VHFA have time for it? I mean,
You are personally appointed to that.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
I want to be clear. I hope not a lot's getting kicked to the chipboard. I'm hoping that we can, again, good governance, build a good process, that it's only things going to chipboard that have been denied, and that we have done a good job with transparent program administration so that it's a rare community project that can't hit the square footage requirement that gets kicked over. And frankly, yeah, I want VHFA on that because I want to make sure that a housing advocate is gonna really kind of cross my arms at that question and say, like, why can't you do 60, 70% floor area for housing? Because to me, everything should be able to. So I think that VHFA is a critical voice there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. A few questions for you, Mark. I was just thinking about the market itself and the pressures of a lack of available housing has made what otherwise would have been workforce housing unaffordable because people are buying it that might have higher incomes. So I'm thinking about the requirement of affordability in the CHIP bill. And thinking that if there is an opportunity to build more housing, this primary housing, you're going to benefit the entire market anyway. Would you agree with that?
100% agree.
So we need.
And that's what the abundance book talks about too, which is we have to just add to the stock in that.
All kinds of housing. So I come back to the question of the criteria of how much of it should be affordable. As maybe they're missing the point. And that's why there's that exception as to the CHIP board could then approve a CHIP district, if you will. I'm not sure what to call it, a CHIP.
Project. It's just one project. It's not a district. It's just a
Right.
project.
Theoretically, except we heard earlier that it might want to have some flexibility on that. If it's not affordable, the CHIP board could say, yeah, it's fine, even if it doesn't meet that affordability requirement. Do you anticipate seeing that happen?
This thing doesn't even exist yet. So anticipate would be a stretch for that. Accountability value shows up with word choices with me. So do I anticipate it? It's possible. And I hope we do, because I also want to be clear that this is the first time I've understood infrastructure investments to be means tested. You know, I don't have to share my income when I drive down the roads or when I receive public services in any other way. So I find it fascinating that with this infrastructure investment, we're doing something a little different. And that becomes one of those guardrails. And I understand why that's happening. But I do think that we should be clear that when there are good, steady, strong roads in Thetford, where emergency services can fly down so the ambulance can, get somewhere. I benefit as a Vermonter. I benefit from school districts other than the one where my kids go to because it's helping all of Vermont. And so I do see this infrastructure investment in the same light that I don't need just those residents and their incomes to be the beneficiaries. I will be thrilled if my daycare worker can live in some of that housing, or if a new Beta employee lives in that housing, because I know how much that's helping our whole economy.
Only two other quick questions. I think. So I'm thinking about where development has occurred without subsidies. And I'm thinking, can you tell us where that has actually happened? I mean, you're looking at the housing market all the time. We look at the necessity of a CHIP district to really develop housing, but it has occurred in many places. And why is that?
It has, and it's happening far less. I mean, I have a whole department in my office that I would say is burnt out. They are crispy individuals right now because there are so many developers who are now coming to us and never did before, who want to do affordable housing because the only way to do housing development right now is through some kind of subsidy. So the legislature has supported some subsidized loan products through the rental revolving loan fund, the middle income homeownership development fund. These are in the budget this year as well. But we have TA programs now we're standing up to help new and emerging developers. And it's great that all these developers want to get into the affordable housing game, and we are breaking our backs to support them and get them in to see that affordable housing development is not big and scary, and we can be nice government officials who help them out. But I actually see far less housing development happening without subsidy. So where it has happened have been in the have towns, not the have nots. I mean, I did see it in Burlington and all that, but also what I saw, again, what I see still going up now and under construction benefited from those low interest rates and locking into rates that I do not hear are going to happen for the next several years, especially now with tariffs and maybe an even more shrinking workforce and all that. I think it's going to get even harder, but there has been some development, but I think it's without subsidy, but it's happening less and less, and only, you know, sorry, but around where I live in Chittenden County.
Actually, you know, I'm gonna go to Representative Holcomb because she's had the last question all the other times, and I'd rather you did.
Well, I think you maybe just.
Wait, no. What?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm gonna go to Representative Holcomb next so that you can have the last question because we had to disrupt the flow.
Save the good ones for you.
Just keep the punches that way and I'll stay back here.
No. I actually so appreciate you coming in and also your big picture grounding of us. And I think we all know this is desperately needed. We have a housing crisis that is driving healthcare crises and education crises. So I appreciate you keeping us grounded in that. And I also appreciate the context I have about, you know, what happened during the favorable times. And I agree, they were much more favorable. And it's interesting that when circumstances are good, people actually are less interested in TIP because it's easier to build in other ways that are less onerous. And this comes back to, again, I don't think anyone questions the value of the work. What's the way to support the work most effectively and efficiently that gets it done? Personally, I really wish we'd use the 77 million in general fund and just set up grant programs because I think it's easier to administer. But if a TIP hasn't been popular before, why is it going to be popular now? And what's the most efficient and effective way to actually get money where it needs to be? Is it through this kind of increment financing or is it through a grant program? I mean, what's easiest for the kinds of development? Because we do have to invest in infrastructure, and that's actually what government does. And if we do that, then the market will take over.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get it there?
Mm-hmm. Well, many people in the room aren't going to want to hear me say this, but appropriations are easier than TIF. I mean, so I will say that, and I have to be on the record for that. At the same time, I spend a lot of time in this building, if you haven't noticed, and I can appreciate that there are other ways for us to solve problems besides just that. I mean, last time I was in here, I think I was talking about the down payment assistance program that VHA runs, which is through a tax credit. That was a brilliant use. I landed at midnight last night from Denver, where I was at the Women's Affordable Housing Network, just so you know, there is one. And everyone now across the country, now half the states have a state tax credit. I'm like, Vermont did that in 2000. Now it's the hot new thing in my world. It's for states to start up a state tax credit. And I'm like, we have a 25-year history of doing this. There are valuable tools other than appropriations that have served this state well. And there have been thousands of Vermonters who've been affordably housed as a result of choosing those other tools. So I also am a big tool in the toolbox kind of person who says that there are other benefits. How people choose TIF, why they choose TIF, I believe it's out of necessity. I don't think, I mean, let me be clear, developers, when they answered that study survey and we did the focus groups, they weren't like, can you please build me the most complex program possible and then I'll choose that to get infrastructure? They said, I want infrastructure money. And then they quickly said, I want a project-based TIF to get it because they knew they could work with that. Just like they're willing to come to VHFA and work with our government programs. I mean, I just want to be clear that we don't also demonize TIFs so much. You come to VHFA to get subsidy for affordable housing, I'm making you jump through some hoops. That's good government. We need to have the kind of municipal oversight that CHIP proposes. We need the VEPC oversight. We need the board. So I think those checks and balances actually create the guardrails and do the things that find that sweet spot of balance between making sure that we're not just handing out checks to anyone who has a dream, but also have a system in place. And so I think that their need for infrastructure is going to spur them. If the economy magically does a 180 and all of a sudden we're in a place of housing abundance and wages are keeping up with growth and all this, and we're in that place, maybe this tool doesn't get used so much and y'all end up looking at the annual reports from VEPC and you sunset it and you retire it because it's not used. Excellent. Maybe it won't be used as much as you think if things turn around. But right now, I do believe that CHIP is the thing that will help turn this around and help us.
But to be clear, can I just to confirm I understand, you're saying the CHIP, the investments are necessary, which I agree with. But what you're saying is a grant program is a more efficient, easier to administer point of view. So that's really on us. We chose to use a more complicated process because you can build guardrails into a grant program.
You and every other legislature and the federal government and even municipalities and all that. I mean, that there are multiple tools of funding and supporting state government and the public investments that y'all want to see.
Thank you. Representative Higley, last question.
Thank you. I think I might have heard you answer Representative Holcomb's other question in regards to whether or not there's enough developers out there.
Mhm.
You said they're, knocking at your door. It sounds like that's the case, correct?
I have been pleasantly surprised. The rental revolving loan fund you all funded 2 years ago and is now still in the budget, so please support that. Had went to all new developers and I'd heard of 2, and I think we funded 13 projects. I had heard of 2 of those developers before. They were all new people. I think I shouldn't give a number, but I think it's a third. But like I would say about a third of them, but I don't know if I'm right. Were people who had moved here since the pandemic. They were either trailing spouses or had moved here on their own and have housing development experience in other states. And now we're bringing that to Vermont. I mean, I had one of the applicants for the revolving loan fund is Summit Development. I'll just tell you who it was. They were coming and won money for their Middlebury project, which is a partnership with Middlebury College. It's been in the news a lot. They were, because of alphabetical order, they were the last ones to present. The applicant got up at our board meeting and said, please don't fund us and give the money to these other projects. Because he was so excited. Summit Development Group has been around since the 80s. We've been funding them since the beginning. And they were like, we have the capacity to move forward and make the housing more affordable with this money, or move forward and the housing won't quite be as affordable. Either way, they were moving forward. He could appreciate that these were small, mostly rural developments with new and emerging developers that weren't going to move forward but for this money. And so, yes, there are a ton more developers than I used to know were here who have both moved into the state or are looking at this. I know folks who have bought portfolios of housing and they're managing it, and now they want to move into development and not just be the property manager, but develop. And so I do think that there's a growth in that. But that's not to say that there's enough and that we don't need more workforce support for them and the construction folks who support them.
Thank you.
Because developers are not always construction companies. So I just want to make sure my language is clear that developers pull the deal together. We still need more of all the trades and all the things.
Representative Odie.
Okay, this is a big picture question. If my premise is right, that predictability is key to building houses, then I'm wondering if CHIP would work in a more predictable way. Because it's guaranteeing access to infrastructure and moving forward with projects, than hoping for yearly appropriations of grants that rely on legislative action that can change from year to year.
I absolutely 100% agree with that, and thank you, because as I said, there's some money in the big bill right now for some VHFA programs, and I know of housing projects that, you know, want to get started, but they don't know, and then I don't know how long your session's going, and then I don't know if things are going to get signed, and then we'll do have to wait for the veto session and all this. And so, as we know, we're talking July before we could open a program. I mean, those housing projects may not have shovels in the ground for an extra year, whereas when there's state tax credits or this CHIP program or whatever, they absolutely, we would have some more expectation there. So I do think that impacts the market. We hear that from VHCB when they come and talk about the need for appropriations. They talk about that sending a signal early in the session and knowing that the money is going to be there is critical for our nonprofit housing development partners.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Folks, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then be right back in here.